Okay, so Shabbat Shalom again. Thank you for everybody who was at the Shacharit with us. And thank you for people who are joining now. And thank you to Dr. Peter Sabo for joining us to teach this morning. Thank you. Maybe you can just say a couple of words about yourself. So people who don't know you better, and then the floor is yours.
I recognize quite a few of you, of course. And thanks again for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to TVO. And I'm totally new to all of this Zoom stuff. I actually had to ask Rabbi Gila when we were talking how everything even works. And this is really good practice because I'm an instructor at the university in Hebrew Bible studies. And yes, I will need to figure out how all this works before the semester begins because it's going fully online for definitely the fall semester, and all evidence points towards that it will be online in the winter semester too. So nice to see you all, and hopefully everybody can hear me okay? My Zoom is not glitchy or anything like that? Okay, that's good. That's a good start. And so let me see if I can share my screen too. I click on that. I press share. That's good?
No, you have to choose.
You have something on the screen.
You can.
There it is. You have
There
to
you go.
choose the right screen to share.
All right. So everybody can see my PowerPoint slide there?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So yes, I thought it would be appropriate, seeing as how Tisha'h B'Av we're in the season. It's on Wednesday, correct? Wednesday. To talk about Megillat Eichah, or the Book of Lamentations, the Scroll of Lamentations. Probably for most Jewish people, this is very obvious, but I thought I'd briefly describe why there's even the two names. In Hebrew, it has a simple name, Eichah, which means how, right? I guess that's actually another thing. Feel free at any time. I like to ask questions. So I think this is everybody's on mute, but then you unclick mute if you want to discuss. So I'll ask rhetorical questions. That means I want people to say something. So Eichah means how, but very early on in Jewish tradition, already in the Talmud and a book called the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew. So in the Talmud, they already started calling it kinot. That should be a very familiar term to you as well, which means something like dirges or sad poems or lamentations. And in the Greek, they translated that as threnoi. That also means lamentation. So that's why there's two titles. So I kind of sometimes I say Eichah, sometimes I say Lamentations. It's just my own switching between the two. So I'll be using both terms. And they both titles are appropriate. Eichah, as we'll talk about, really settles the tone for the whole book. How? It's a book of poems trying to describe the indescribable. And so this question, how, kind of functions as a nice title for the meaning behind the entire book. And Lamentations is very accurate too, because it's a book of sad poems, of laments. So my idea today is, clearly we're not going to be able to talk about all the poetry, and I don't think we'll be settling on the purpose of Lamentations, but to talk about some of the poetic features of Eichah, and something about maybe biblical poetry in general. People are excited to talk about poetry, hopefully. My sister's like, you're going to talk about poetry and a little bit of history? Are you sure people are going to be interested? I'm like, well, maybe not. I'm not sure. Hopefully, I always ask my class whenever I talk about biblical poetry, how many people regularly read poetry? And the number's always not very big. So we'll see. But I think in Jewish tradition, you have so much liturgy. So about a third of the Hebrew of the Tanakh is poetry. So it's worth knowing something about biblical poetry. All right. So I want to start not by looking at Eichah, but about a prose account of the destruction of the first temple in the Tanakh. And to do that, we have to set a little bit of the context, which is in the 6th century BCE, and the first temple was destroyed in 586 or 587 BCE, and Eichah was written probably very closely after that. So in the 6th century BCE, the kingdom of Judah, people can see my cursor, by the way. You can see when someone say yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
You can see my cursor there. There's Jerusalem, stuck in between the kingdom of Egypt and a growing empire at the time, the Babylonian Empire, which became to basically control all of the ancient Near East besides that kingdom of Egypt. So talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. The kingdom of Judah and little Jerusalem here were stuck in between the new Babylonian Empire and the kingdom of Egypt, both which wanted to take over as much land as possible. And there was the kingdom of Judah stuck right in between the two of them. One of the last kings of Judah, Zedekiah, you can see in the book of Melachim in Kings, he rebelled against Babylon. And what does it mean that he rebelled against Babylon? What do people think? He rebelled. What does that mean?
He sought alliance with Egypt instead.
Yep. And he didn't pay taxes to the Babylonians. And like most cold, indifferent, large empires, do you think the Babylonians really enjoyed that? No. They decided to act, and here's the Babylonians' reaction as recorded in Melachim. And they, the Babylonian army, slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and bound him in fetters, and carried him to Babylon. Now in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year, and we'll say his name in English, the year of the king Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. And he burnt the house of Adonai and the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every great man's house burnt he with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls of Jerusalem round about. And the residue of the people that were left in the city, and those that fell away, that fell to the king of Babylon, and the residue of the multitude did Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carry away captive. But the captain of the guard left of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and farmers. So before we go to the other slide, how would you describe this account of the destruction of Jerusalem? Very
Not sure what you're asking.
Oh, sorry. This is a prose account, and it's very straightforward. It's focused on dates. And let's compare it. Maybe the question will make more sense when we compare it to the opening lines of Eichah. How lonely, and I'll just have it in English. We'll look at the Hebrew in a bit more closely. How lonely sits the city, once so full of people. She has become a widow, mistress among the nations. The princess of the provinces has become a slave. She weeps aloud in the night with a tear upon her cheek. Among all her lovers, there is no one to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile under affliction and harsh slavery. She dwells among the nations, but finds no place to rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of her distress. So I suppose the question I'll ask now is a very simple one. How is this passage different than the previous description of Jerusalem's destruction and the people's exile?
Well, the first one's very clinical.
Right.
Only the facts, ma'am, no sentiment. The second one is full of sentiment and really no facts.
Right.
Can you explain why? I mean, the poetry starts with how lonely the city, the city is she's become the widow, and there's no one to comfort her. She's been betrayed. Then it says Judah has gone into exile, and then back to she dwells among the nations, but finds no place to rest. So Judah is all her pursuit. So she still refers to the city being abandoned, kind of.
Are you just thinking about the kind of personification of the city as a woman?
Yeah, but I mean, verse 3, Judah has gone into exile. So that's not the city. The city
Right.
is still she.
Right.
But then it says she has no place to rest and her pursuers overtaken her. Sounds like she's on the move as well.
Right. I suppose the easiest answer to that question is, and this is actually common in all of the biblical prophetic books, the city of Jerusalem stands as a symbol for the kingdom of Judah as a whole.
Okay.
So it's used intertwined. Sometimes you'll see Jerusalem, sometimes you'll see Judah. They're often just synonymous. They're just referring.
If I could interject, from what I've read of the archaeology, there wasn't much of the kingdom of Judah outside of Jerusalem. Really, there were just a sprinkling of towns around Jerusalem, and then beyond that into the Philistines, and north of there you get into the area of the Assyrian Empire at the time. Well, the Assyrian Empire had collapsed by that point, but the kingdom of Judah was a pretty weak thing, actually, from what we can see from the archaeology.
We're losing you, Robert, or I've lost a good connection.
I think I heard about most of that, though, which I very much agree with. The kingdom of Judah was a very small player, and there wasn't much of it outside of the city of Jerusalem. Archaeology definitely does show that Jerusalem was not really that big at this time either, but all of the surrounding settlements were very small, and the kingdom of Judah wasn't something really grand at this time.
Okay, I think I've reframed my reading because I have such profound insight into this. But I think it's all about Jerusalem / Judah / being kicked out and being alone and wandering amongst all the nations. So I'm no longer thinking of it as she like Jerusalem, the city, abandoned and empty, but in a fixed place. I don't think that's what this is.
Well, we're going to
despite the first verse. The first lines makes it sound like that, but everything else is like she's lonely and on the move and been abandoned and has no place to rest. Okay, thank you.
Well, we're going to look more closely at the first two verses for sure. Like I said, we could spend probably a whole year or more looking at all the deep poetry of Eichah, but for now, I want to go back to Paula's initial comment, right? That the first, I think that was Paula who said the bare bones, right? And you saw the passage from Kings was focused on dates, just described. Think about it, the king's watching his son's eyes being torn, or watching his sons be slaughtered, and then his eyes are taken out, but it doesn't have much emotion, right? More generally, we'd say poetry is what compared to prose? How would we define poetry? It does what?
Subjective.
I was going to say, I would say that the poetry appeals to the emotion and to the senses. And it's, in this case, from the inside as opposed to an objective outsider.
Mm-hmm. Robert, did you say so? We couldn't quite hear you.
I used the word subjective.
Right. So we have subjective, it's highlights emotions, feelings. Typically poetry has a distinctive style, right? It has a distinctive style. So let's move on. How do I want to talk briefly just.
Can I say just one thing? I was suddenly struck when you were saying, when people were talking about emotions here. It doesn't only describe emotions, it's supposed to play with our emotions. Like poetry is supposed to cause emotions in us if it's good poetry. So it's not just subjective, it also has like it has an intent in emotions.
Here's a good word for that, which I was evocative.
Right.
Or manipulative. Yeah.
Well,
evocative, yeah, better.
The passage from Kings just wants to describe what happened. Here, it wants to give you a sense of intensity. And yes, evocative is a really good word too. I like that. Subjective, emotions, style. We'll talk about rhythm, just even the way that poetry reads. So, in a brief comment to talk about biblical poetry, we need to a little bit get rid of our Western notion of poetry to understand biblical poetry, okay? When you were taught in the Western world in your English classes about poetry, the first thing that they'll kind of teach you if you read, say, Shakespeare, is about meter, like iambic pentameter, right? Biblical poetry, for millennia, people have tried to find meter in biblical poetry, and it's just not there. It doesn't have a standardized meter. It doesn't have a set type of emphasis on the syllables necessarily. The Masoretes put some cantillation marks there so that we know when how to pronounce certain words and in what rhythm to give them, but there's no meter. And there's no specialized form, or usually I'll say there's no specialized form like the sonnet, right? You know the sonnet has 14 lines, A, B, et cetera, et cetera.
Peter, can I interrupt with a question?
Yep.
When you say it has no meter, do you mean there's no overarching meter, or each individual piece of poetry itself has no meter within it?
Good. There's no overarching meter. There's no overarching meter. There clearly is, as we'll see, some sense of meter and rhythm are hard to, you get a little bit fuzzy with poetry there. What's the difference between meter and rhythm? But there's no overarching meter and there's no specialized form. When you see a sonnet from Shakespeare, you can tell that it's poetry, right? It follows a set pattern. Biblical poetry doesn't have that. And in our Western world, probably most of the time, does that answer your question, Robert?
Yep.
I think it's got meter and rhythm. It's just within the words and the wordplay and repetition.
It definitely has rhythm. We will definitely talk about the rhythm. It definitely has rhyming. It has style. But
it doesn't have a certain set structure.
Sorry, say that again.
It doesn't have a certain set structure like haiku or limerick.
Right, exactly. And when most of us think about poetry in the Western world, the other thing we think about is rhyming at the end of lines, right? What's the good example? Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord. So it rhymes at the end of each line, but biblical poetry doesn't have that either. There's words that rhyme, but it's not at the end of the line all the time, right? There actually is, though, a very basic feature of biblical poetry. And this does give it a sense of rhythm. And one could say some metrical aspect to it. And it's called parallelism. So if you look, parallelism is kind of briefly defined as the use of a component in a sentence, one sentence, so it's one line, that has the same or similar construction in sound, meaning, or rhythm. So basically, the second half of a line will parallel the first half. I think I have some examples here. This is taken from Psalms, just easy example. In the way of righteousness is life, and in its pathway there is no death. So you see how life corresponds to no death, way corresponds to pathway. It's parallel. Who will live in your tent? Who will dwell on your holy mountain? Tent corresponds to holy mountain. Who will, and then live, and then dwell. It's a nice parallel sequence. The second half of the line parallels the first half. And scholars have said, well, basically there's three types of parallelism, broadly speaking, that one can find in the Hebrew Bible. The first, which is the easiest to find, is synonymous parallelism, where the second line of the verse synonymously parallels that of the first line. Antithetic is when the second line contrasts with the first line. And synthetic is when the second line builds upon the first line. So it intensifies or it elaborates upon the first part of the line. So do you want to play a small little game? This is, keep in mind, synonymous and antithetic and synthetic, okay? So let's play a little game and we'll look at some random verses from the Hebrew Bible, and we'll say which type of parallelism it is, okay? Praise Adonai with the lyre, make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. What type of parallelism is that?
Synonymous.
That's always the easy one to get, right? When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but wisdom is with the humble.
Antithetic.
Antithetic. Lift up, O gates, your head, and be lifted up, O eternal doors. This one.
I'll let someone else talk.
Synonymous. Synonymous. Here's Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not want. This one's synthetic, right? You have this part, Adonai is my shepherd, and the second part elaborates on that and says, because Adonai is my shepherd, there's nothing that I lack. A false balance is an abomination to Adonai, but an accurate weight is his delight. This is antithetic. So let's take an example from the last chapter of Eichah, the 5th chapter. And if you look at the lines, we see how they're parallel. Remember, Adonai, what has come upon us. Behold and see our reproach. So here, they're basically 5 lines of synonymous parallelism. Our inheritance is turned into unto strangers. Our houses unto aliens. So inheritance and house is parallel, and they're turned into strangers and unto aliens. We are become orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. We have drunk our water for money. Our wood cometh to us for price. To our very necks we are pursued. We labor and have no rest. So you could say maybe the 5th verse is maybe synthetic parallelism. Any questions about parallelism before I move on to some other aspects of specifically about the poetry of Lamentations? Or any thoughts?
We have absolutely no.
Well, I just have a question.
Yeah.
I just have a question as to what the function of the parallelism is, sort of psychologically, and why is this a poetic device?
Well, that's a really difficult question for the function psychologically. I would say on the one hand, it's it functions, and I'm not sure this is a great answer to your question, but when you see lines in parallelism, it lets you know that you're in the realm of poetry. It lets you know that this is going to be a different type of writing than prose. And it lets you know when people write in poetry, it's not, when people write in prose, you can kind of, as we go back, it's just kind of giving a description, and you don't think about language as such. When you see something in poetry, you know that the poet's drawing your attention to the form and the style of how it's being described. So it sets you in kind of the right mode to read it, if that makes sense. But that's a really good question. And honestly, I'm sure there's some people who have worked about the bigger ideas about what the function of parallelism as a specific poetic feature might function psychologically.
Dorothy could answer us. I just would say it's a repetition. They take an idea and then they repeat it and elaborate on it, you know, a little more distantly, you know, make more of a metaphor in the second line, maybe. Anyways.
That's a really great comment too, that it's about repetition too. It creates a sense of, you know, as I said, it's not standardized meter, but it creates a sense of rhythm. Repeating is a very, very common aspect of biblical poetry. Any other comments?
There's a comment in the chat, which I think is a good one, asking if we have any sense that this was to be sung, because many of the features of Western poetry, what we think of as poetic, come from the fact that they were songs originally.
Right. That's a really good question. Yes, we have lots of evidence that ancient Israelites sang, but the one difference I would say, and as I said, the poetry itself refers to the actual instruments. Like, you remember the psalm we said, praise Adonai with the lyre, right? A musical instrument. And you have repeated references to these musical instruments being used. By the way, that was beautiful flute playing earlier today. That I just came in for the last little bit of the flute playing. But we don't know the actual rhythmic cantillation markers that you read in the book of Eichah today were put in by the Masoretes sometime around 500 CE of our era, of the Common Era. And so that's a long time after these were originally written. So we don't know exactly how they were sung. That's probably the easiest answer.
If
All
I
right.
could, if I could make a comment, you've talked about the formalistic, formal nature of poetry. But what is achieved by this formal structure, it seems to me, is a process of intensification, so that we dive into it. We're not allowed just to read a line and go on the way you would with prose. So that would be my comment, that the form serves the function of intensifying our feeling and elaborating our picture.
I wish all my classes had such good comments, and I would say intensification is a really important aspect of this, right? That it's emotional intensity and kind of linguistic intensity as well, from line to line. That's a really insightful comment. I wish I could see, how do I see who makes, or I have to click on this to see, I see. Sorry about that.
Peter, if you go to gallery view, then you'll see us boxed.
Ah, right, right, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna move on here. Let's take a closer look, and we'll include some of the Hebrew as well. Just looking at verse 1. As I said, I'm not gonna take up 10 hours of your time by looking at everything very closely. This, of course, should be very familiar to you, the first little bit. Eichah yashava badad, ha'ir rabati am. How lonely she sits, the city once full of people. She has become like a widow, mistress among the nations, princess among the provinces. She has become a slave. So we see some parallelism, of course, in these lines. What else do people notice about these lines? Other comments about the poetry? Any other thoughts? Somebody made the initial comment. The thing that maybe sticks out to us right away is the personification of the city. The imagery of personifying the city as a woman. So the city sits, and it's likened to a widow. What, of course, likening the city to a widow might imply what? What type of adjectives would you describe to that? She's become like a widow, meaning what?
She's in mourning.
An object of pity.
An object of pity. She's in mourning. Yes. What else?
She used to have a partner.
Used to have a partner.
She's unprotected.
Unprotected. She's become like a widow, and the last verse doesn't even include the simile. She has become a slave, right? Or a thrall. And you see a bunch of contrasts. You see she has become like a widow, but she was once mistress or noblewoman among the nations. That she was once a princess, but she's become a slave. She was once full of people, but now she's empty. She's lonely. Another aspect of poetry is careful choice of diction, or getting the right words, and or using words that contain lots of different meanings. If you look closely here, you see in this first line, in the first two lines, that the word rabati up here is used twice. And it actually has two different possible meanings. If you read it in English, and this is one of the problems of reading poetry in translation, you don't get the full sense of all the different connotations of a word. You'll see lots of different English translations because people don't know whether to take rabati as an adjective, which means something like full or great, or as a noun, meaning noblewoman or mistress. So for instance, this second line, which I've translated as mistress or noblewoman among the nations, could be translated, and it often is, I think JPS even does this, as great among the nations. So they translate both this rabatis as adjectives, but it's ambiguous in the Hebrew. So it has two different meanings.
But why is it ambiguous? If you follow the pattern of the way the second part of the phrase goes, it starts saying she was so great.
Right.
And then the second part is, but now look how she's fallen and she's lonely.
Right.
Her
So
princess has become a slave. The only exception, I guess, is the first line where both is a description. It's the inverse.
I guess probably to answer that question, let's quickly go to this here. That the second and third lines have a chiastic structure, and this might depend on how you give the translation. So you see, if you translate rabati as mistress or noblewoman, it parallels sarati, princess. So noblewoman here, princess here. And it starts out, chiastic is where the beginning parallels the end, like envelope structure. It's a fancy word for envelope structure. So, but if you translate this rabati as full, then you have the parallelism between the first line and the second line, right? If you said this was great and this was full. So it depends whether you think that it parallels mostly the third line or the first line. That's why it's so nice and ambiguous, because it could function both ways. Does that make sense to people, that description there? hopefully. And I did want to point out that, again, there is no official rhyming, but like on the end of lines, but think about the rhythm created in this beautiful poetry. The repetition of Rabati twice and Sarati and the chiastic structure. It creates a nice rhythm and sound play.
Maybe the rabbi should read it slowly.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. As Eichah yashva vadad. Wait, I'm going to read it from my Tanakh because I have the cantillation here, so I know where to start. Eichah yashva vadad, ha'ir rabati am, hayta ke'almana, rabati v'goyim, sarati b'medinot, hayta lamas.
Beautiful. Maybe you wanted to do it on this one as well if you already have it out.
Okay. So it's verse 2? Okay.
Yeah.
בכה תבכה בלילה ודמעתה על לחיה, אין לה מנחם מכל אוהביה, כל רעיה בגדו בה, היו לה לאויבים.
So what do we think, again, you could focus on the English or the Hebrew here. What do you see that's poetic potentially or interesting?
There's a visual image that's conjured up of this weeping woman at night, weeping alone.
Right. Isn't that a beautiful image? It's many translations will put her tears are upon her cheek, but it's singular there. She has a single tear upon her cheek. She weeps bitterly, but there is a single tear upon her cheek.
It's also the emphasis of bachot tivche. It's using the same word. So the importance here of that word. Bachot tivche is, they could just have used one of those words. It's the same, if I'm not mistaken, and my Hebrew's a little rusty, but it seems to me it's the same word. Bachot tivche is this.
Yes. Yes, it is. They're both from bacha, which is to weep. But actually, on that, maybe I'll point out one of my first points is it's a possible onomatopoeia, actually. Many scholars have thought of this first line here. Think about it. Bacho tivke balela. It's, you could say she blubbers. You have the threefold repetition of the bait there. So it's at the very least alliteration, possible onomatopoeia. I thought I'd also emphasize that this second line here, she hath none to comfort her, is a recurring refrain in the entire first chapter, repeated over and over again, that Jerusalem has no one to comfort her. So repeated here in this verse and 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 5 times repeated that there's no comfort. Another part of the repetition of poetry. And then there's a beautiful, beautiful wordplay here between she hath none to comfort her among all her lovers. And that word for lover in the participle, that would be ohev. So the word for a lover is ohev. And all her ohevs, or all her lovers, have turned into enemies, oyev. It's a beautiful wordplay, just switching the one letter between lovers, how simple the difference is between lovers and enemies. And what does that suggest to you, that metaphor of all of her lovers? Who are her lovers? Any guesses or thoughts?
As used in the proverb, it's usually sort of suggesting like allies of the kingdom of Judah.
Very much so. So one of her lovers could have potentially been Egypt, right? She turned to her lovers and they became enemies. So it personifies Judah and Jerusalem as somebody who had former lovers. And again, we'll talk about this in a little bit, about this common prophetic trope of Jerusalem as a wayward wife who had many lovers. So we've seen widowhood, lovers. That's at least 2 metaphors so far.
Can I just say something about this me'oyev le'ohev? And
Yeah.
thank you for pointing this out. It just brought to mind that the author Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, he has a short story called Me'oyev le'ohev. And I think if I read it, it would have been in high school. So that's 2 days ago. Maybe my mom can add more information. But if I remember correctly, he's walking around Yerushalayim, right? And there's some, I can't exactly remember the story, but I'm wondering if he took the name from this story from Eichah, from Me'oyev le'ohev.
Right.
It just kind of, yeah, it jumped up.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
I wonder, yeah.
Yeah.
It is a great wordplay.
Yeah.
The subtle difference between a lover and an enemy.
Sometimes it's 2 sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to go too quickly. I do want us to, but I am going to move on. This will be, I think, one of our last or second last verses that we look at a little bit more closely. And Rabbi Gila, would you mind actually doing that again?
So that's verse 11.
Yeah. Oh, this is from chapter 2, sorry.
Chapter 2, verse 11.
Yeah.
כלו בדמעות עיניי, חמרמרו מעי, נשפך לארץ כבדי, על שבר בת עמי, בעטף עולל ויונק ברחובות קריה.
So here we see the translation that my eyes fail with tears, my bowels murmur. My liver or liver bile is poured out upon the earth for the breach of the daughter of my people, because the nurslings and the sucklings collapse in the city squares. So I won't ask any difficult ones. I just want to point out again that there's another possible onomatopoeia here. It's my bowels homarmaru. So it's like my bowels murmur. That's what I tried to get across in the translation. And that's an interesting idiom here. My eyes fail with tears, my bowels murmur, my liver bile is poured out on the earth. This is an interesting pairing of the eyes with murmuring bowels and poured out liver bile. What do all these have in common, these tearing eyes and murmuring bowels?
Well, it's a strong physical reaction, what you get in those moments of extreme grief or extreme fear.
Exactly, yeah. And
That's just bodily fluids.
Yeah, exactly. Bodily fluids. I was going to turn this over to Paula.
yes, bodily fluids. They all are secreting bodily fluids.
Yeah, signs of distress.
Right. And in a little bit, you have to know the idiom of biblical Hebrew here. Murmuring, when we say in our common idioms, if somebody says my bowels are upset, they're talking about possibly being sick to the stomach in some way. In biblical Hebrew, the bowels were the seat of emotions.
They are. There's more serotonin receptors in the gut than anywhere else in the body.
Right, it's probably more accurate. So and whereas heart is an idiom in biblical Hebrew for intellect, for the mind. So here you have, when they're saying my bowels murmur, it's about being emotionally exhausted, emotionally spent. And it really links them nicely by focusing on these 3 different kind of secreting fluids.
It's an argument for universal precautions.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And then there's the last little bit, because the nurslings and the sucklings collapse in the city squares. Throughout the first 2 chapters, and really chapters 1, 2, and 4 in general, there's a focus on the suffering of the young and children. I've included here some quotes. I won't bother to read them all. But poetically, or kind of literally, in terms of a sense of literature, what do you think the poetic text is trying to get at by focusing on the suffering of the young?
Lack of a future?
They're the future.
They're the future, yeah. Yeah.
It's also extremity when the children are decimated, let's say. That marks a level of extremity.
Right.
I'll go to what I said at the beginning about what poetry does to us. It makes the whole thing seem even worse. I think
Right.
some people, when you read about, the children dying, and it just, the whole tragedy becomes emotionally more difficult to deal with.
Exactly. Children emphasize, think about the specific words being used here, the diction, olel and yonek. I translate as nurslings and sucklings. These aren't just young children. They're infants still dependent upon their mothers.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so that's definitely a link, a connection to the idea of nursing and suckling. So I know this is remote because when I read it again, I see that they're not talking about that, but it's another kind of bodily fluid.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, it's another type of bodily fluid. And I think we're going to move on to, I think, my last verse that we're looking at, but the focus on children emphasizes Jerusalem was punished, and Lamentations agrees this, uses the same theological reason, because Jerusalem and her inhabitants sinned against God. They rebelled against God. But then...
Female. Why are we making this curse on the female body? Is it just a metaphor or a vehicle for this suffering, or is it, is there a pattern that I don't know about because I don't know about it enough that when you're talking about abasement and problems and suffering there, we're using the female body as the vehicle?
Excellent question, but I will answer it in 2 slides from now, or we'll discuss it in 2 slides from now. How about that?
Well, we talked about this at a recent Shabbat or something. You talked about the trope of talking about Jerusalem as a wayward wife,
Right.
and so the lovers are not just foreign powers, but they're also foreign gods, right? And there's this constant imagery of Adonai as the jealous husband who's been betrayed by his wife, and it's all very misogynistic.
Yes. Yeah.
And I ask a grammatical question. I thought, and I could be very wrong, that a city is feminine gender in Hebrew grammar. Am I right?
Yeah, grammatically, yes.
So it makes sense that all of this is feminine imagery to me. Maybe that's simplistic, but that's one of my thoughts.
Well, actually, one of the recurring titles given, it's not just the word for city. It's, you see here, it's always Bat, daughter, Bat Zion, daughter Zion, daughter of my people. So the feminine imagery is always put upon with the titles for the cities too. But again, I want to bracket that discussion because I have 2 slides. In 2 slides, we'll discuss that in more detail. I want to emphasize for now, just the focus on children emphasizes and highlights unjust suffering and innocence. Children are innocent, especially sucklings and nurslings, right? And yet they still suffer and are punished. And the book of Eichah draws attention to the suffering of the children to emphasize, was this okay that children also had to suffer? It leads us to probably the most chilling verse in the book for me, or one of the most chilling verses. This verse here. Rabbi Gila, this will be the last time I promise, Rabbi Gila, this last one. It's from 2:20. Are you there? Rabbi Gila?
With myself, yes. Okay. ראה אדוני והביטה, למי עוללת כה? אם תאכלנה נשים פריים, עוללי טיפוחים, אם יהרג במקדש אדוני כהן ונביא.
All right. So there's a pun in this verse that's very disturbing in a way. If not the kind of surface level aspect of the verse is disturbing itself. It asks God to look and say, who have you done this to? Right? And it points attention to the fact that women are eating their own children because they're starving during the city siege. And that the priests and prophets have been slain in the sanctuary of Adonai. So the pun in this verse is on the word for asking, where you say, when God looks, poet asks God to look and consider, to whom have you done this? And that's from a verb alal, ayin lamed lamed, and then points out that women eat their own sucklings, oleo. The pun is basically connecting God's actions to the women eating their own children. To me, go ahead.
Tipuchim mean?
Sorry, you cut out there. I couldn't hear which one. Tipuchim? Is that what you were asking?
Tipuchim, yeah, the end of the second one.
It's something like it's in construct there. It's like they care for, or they dandied.
That's
That's
good.
something like that. Yeah. To me, this verse emphasizes it highlights what I was just talking about, the kind of focus on the suffering of children. And then it points out that women are so hungry, they're eating their own children in the city siege. But it points to what I would consider a central paradox of the book. And that's that the people of Judah and Jerusalem, according to, and there's other verses in Eichah which say this, and the biblical prophets emphasize it over and over again, they were punished because they rebelled against God. Okay? This is why they were punished. But in Eichah, the focus isn't on why they were punished, but to the extent that they were punished. So when the people are punished, this exposes that God's people, the chosen people, might not always be protected. Here's a case where the chosen people were forced, the women of the city were forced to eat their own children. And would a parent do the same to their children? Do you see what the pun is kind of pointing to? Maybe it helps to discuss a little bit more about a disturbing theme of the book, which is that cannibalism again appears later in the book explicitly in chapter 4, where it says the hands of compassionate women have boiled their own children. The children became their food in the destruction of my dear people. There's a hint of it in another chapter, in another passage in chapter 2, that says the lives of children drain away at the bosom of their mothers. So I'll ask another question here. Cannibalism was an actual aspect of city sieges in the ancient Near East. When people laid siege to cities and they camped outside, they would try to starve them to death. However, there's something, we got to remember that this is poetry, and all the examples of cannibalism in the book have a common thread. So think about in 2:20, there's a common thread. It's not just cannibalism. What type of cannibalism is it?
Mothers eating their kids.
Yeah.
And they're not eating us, basically. So
Right. So elaborate upon that. I think why would you say that's kind of ironic?
either ironic or very radical theology, but they make, so what the poetry does in a sense here, and thank you for pointing this out, is that with the Lemi Olal Tako and Olalei Tipuchim, so this, what do you call it, the tikbolet, what you said before about poetry, parallelisms in a sense. So Adonai turns into the mother, or the mother is Adonai in a sense. And then they're showing what Adonai is doing to us, eating us. We are the children of Adonai.
Right.
We are Adonai's children, and Adonai is eating us in this situation. So, so if you say that, yeah, so which makes the whole situation even worse. It moves in a sense from what we have been talking about of ourselves and Adonai in a sort of sacred marriage situation where we are, you know, Adonai's wayward wife to becoming Adonai's eaten children.
Right.
Which is more striking.
And it's a reversal of the natural order of things. Women should nourish and feed their children. And in this extreme situation, women are using their own children for food and nourishment.
And
Their
Adonai
own
should nurture and grow us, and then Adonai is eating us.
Yep.
Can I take this to an extreme? These describe behaviors of ungodly people, of neighboring tribes that might support cannibalism or force cannibalism. And to this extent, God becomes like the enemy rather than like the nurturing father. He's put us into the hands of evil. Now that I know that's extreme, but it's one of the things that comes to my mind.
It's that if you think that's that extreme.
There's a verse.
Yeah.
There's a verse in chapter 2 that literally says God has become our enemy.
Yep. There it is.
It made me also think, pardon?
Yeah, verse 5. Haya Adonai ke'oyev.
Yep.
Verse 5.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, continue on, Robert.
This talk about killing of children also made me think of the practice of the Moloch sacrifice, which was part of the Canaanite religion and denounced in the Bible, but evidence that was maybe a fairly recent innovation that they decided not to do that kind of human sacrifice anymore.
Right.
So I'm thinking of that as sort of a backdrop to this talk about killing of children.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
Or it's a perversion of the sacrifices of the temple.
Right. Wow. Really. Yeah. Really good thoughts. How am I doing time-wise, Rabbi Gila? Should I move on?
Yeah, you can continue. You've given us a lot to think about here in these verses.
Yeah, these ones, I just want to make sure that I cover the what we were talking about before, because I think that's another good point of discussion. We talked about...
Quick question, I'm sorry, when was this written? Who was the audience, so to speak?
That's a good question. Tradition, Jewish Christian tradition, of course, will both ascribe it to the prophet Jeremiah. And it's perfectly fine to think about Jeremiah as the prophet. It's written clearly by somebody who's seen the destruction firsthand. Almost all biblical scholars say that it was written within 10, 20 years, if not sooner, after the destruction of the first temple. Okay. And it's pointing out, because of course this is somebody who's experienced the suffering and saw these types of things. So and the audience is probably other Judaism. Is that good? going to move on real quickly, okay? So we talked about the personification of the city as a woman and some misogynistic imagery, but it gets worse. So the Bible isn't always, as people know, full of nice little verses. It's got as much darkness as it does light, certainly from a patriarchal perspective. So there's some other imagery in the book that should cause us for pause, that should cause pause. We see in 117, here again, we have the theme of Zion having nobody to comfort her. Adonai has commanded concerning Jacob that his neighbors should be his adversaries. Jerusalem has become a nidah, a menstruating woman. You actually have a very similar type of imagery earlier in the first chapter. Jerusalem has sinned grievously, so she has become a menstruating woman. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. And perhaps that word might be even better translated as genitals in this context. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Her downfall was appalling, with none to comfort her. O Adonai, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed. So I think it was Judith or somebody. Well, I mean, this of course is patriarchal and misogynistic imagery. I would like to know further people's thoughts about, of course, what's it trying to emphasize by saying Jerusalem's a menstruating woman?
Well, a menstruating woman had to separate herself from everyone. So
Right.
it's that image of isolation.
Yes, isolation, yeah.
And uncleanness generally, right? Isn't that?
Yes, uncleanness, ritual state of impurity, yeah.
But this is not isolation. What should be private and in isolation. Nidal is not public business, and here it is.
Right.
And I think that contrast is horrifying and significant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It also signifies spilling of blood.
Right.
Blood is sacred.
Yeah, exactly. There is a focus on blood throughout the book. And Judith, did you want to go back to that original comment you made, which I think was very interesting? Why did the poet have to choose? Yes, grammatically, cities are feminine, but the poet seems to be doing something else here, right? It's taking some more liberties with this metaphor, if you would put it maybe that way.
Strangely, I don't have a comment.
All right, I think
I don't know the history of and the poetry and the history of the culture enough to know, because obviously, but I don't think it's unique to, actually, now that I think of it, unique to this era or
No.
this culture or this religion, that if you want to talk about the embodiment of suffering and abasement, that you use women's bodies as your vehicle. I don't know, I could be wrong. I very much could be wrong. I'm making this up. So I won't stop now.
I have a quote here from Naomi Seidman. She's a Jewish scholar. When she reads Eichah and she saw this metaphor, this is her reaction. Is Lamentations itself yet another outrage, heaping a man's distaste for women onto the already painful enough outrages of Jewish history? For me, she says, the city woman's disgrace is a poor allegory for the sins of her men who take cover under these skirts. That's her. She actually has a really great essay called Burning the Book of Lamentations that I was going to give some quotes from, but I thought that'd be a little bit too much time-wise. I want to say, so here you have the description about daughter Zion from the poet, And I won't talk about this, but look at other passages in Eichah. What's interesting about this passage here? All her people groan as they search for bread. They trade their treasures for food to revive their strength. Look, O Adonai, and see how worthless I have become. Is it nothing to you all who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me, which Adonai afflicted on the day of his fierce anger. From on high he sent fire, it went deep into my bones. He spread a net for my feet, he turned me back. He has left me stunned, faint all day long. And it goes on in the next verses. What's potentially interesting about these verses? It's that the city, the personified city, speaks in her own voice. This is actually one of the longest quotations from a female character in all of the Hebrew Bible, of a woman speaking for this long. It's very interesting that you have these poetic descriptions of daughter Zion, focusing on her becoming, say, a menstruating woman. But when daughter Zion speaks for herself, she focuses only on her suffering. Some scholars have called the book of Eichah the time where daughter Zion speaks back to the prophets. The prophets are always saying, oh, she deserves her sin so much. Finally here she says, okay, maybe I deserve my punishment, but did it have to be so bad? Did it have to be like this? I will only talk about, so actually throughout the book, it's a very interesting, you can trace it when you read the entire, all of Eichah, there's different speaking voices. You have a third person narrator. That's the beginning, how lonely sits the city that was once full of people. You have the first person voice of daughter Zion. You have a first person voice of a symbolic male sufferer. That happens in chapter 3. Switches to a first person voice of a man. And then at the end of the book, and this tells you something, you have the first person plural voice of the community. The community speaks. How do you answer, or Judith, did you want to say something? Yeah. Go ahead.
No, thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy
Oh,
Garber.
there's
Thank
two.
you. I think I missed the beginning. Did you guys start early?
I don't know what time usually.
Did you start a bit early?
Probably, maybe, I don't know.
Okay, sorry. For some reason I missed the beginning, but
That's
anyway,
okay.
is this a dialogue? Like in the last slide, the last two slides.
Mhm.
So women are, Jerusalem is the menstruating woman and all of the problems and bad things that go along with that. And then in the next slide, so maybe you're starting to speak to this now with the different narration, but the way you're presenting it, it seems like a dialogue.
Some people take it as a dialogue. There's one scholar who thinks that there's 18 speaking voices in the book. I don't read the book like that. I think that there's generally different speaking voices, and that if there is a dialogue, it's in the first two chapters between the voice of daughter Zion, who interjects the poet. The poet starts speaking, and he describes her in a certain way. And she says, true, look at that, but look how much I've suffered. Probably some of the most intensely emotional passages are in the voice of daughter Zion herself. And her consistent focus as well is on the pain of children. Almost all the passages that we mentioned where it focuses on children, that's in daughter Zion's voice. It's very interesting. So there's the book kind of plays, I wouldn't read it as a dialogue, but it plays between the difference between gender and suffering. and between feminine voices and male voices. And then it ends with, I think very significantly, the voice of the community in the first person plural. That's the last speaking voice that you have.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. Last comment, last slide, last two slides, I think. I little bit lied to you. Is there overarching poetic structures to biblical poetry? Yes, there's one that's very obvious that Hebrew poets use all the time. That's not on the level of line, but it's very much like a sonnet. And you probably already know this, but let's take a look. Here's the Hebrew English. Okay, the first line of verse 1, Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. You see? It's an acrostic. And actually, that's the same form in the second chapter. You see? It's also an alphabetic acrostic. So, and then take a look at the third chapter. Aleph, 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 Beit, 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 Gimel, Gimel, Gimel. The acrostic feature is most intense in the chapter 3, where every line of 3 lines is a different letter of the alphabet. Chapter 4, this is an acrostic as well. But take a look, chapter 5. Chapter 5 is not an acrostic. All the rest of them are, not chapter 5. But do you notice something interesting? "22 lines. No acrostic, but Rabbi Gila?
The number of the letters.
Yes,
of the
22.
alphabet.
So it's kind of hauntingly present in that last chapter. There's no acrostic, but it follows the same structure with 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, 22 lines in the last chapter. So an acrostic is where, it's the first letter. And in the Hebrew Bible, what we have is alphabetic acrostics. Acrostic is very common in biblical poetry and, of course, common in Jewish liturgy as well. One of my favorites is the description of the perfect wife in the book of Proverbs, and it follows the Hebrew alphabet. We won't look at that. Very famously, Psalm 119:2 is a 9-line acrostic. So it has 9 lines that start with Aleph, 8 lines that start with Aleph, 8 lines that start with Beit. So I have a question. So chapters 1 and 2, they're 3-line acrostics, only the first line alphabetical. Chapter 3 is 3-line acrostic, every line's alphabetical. Chapter 4 is a 2-line acrostic, and chapter 5 is no acrostic, but it's 22 lines. So why do you think Lamentations employed the form of the acrostic? Why would these poems be written from Aleph to Tav?
I mean, was that not done before? It was done before, wasn't it? Or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, is it novel at the time this was written? I don't think so.
It's not novel, but why choose the specific poetic form? What might it symbolize?
I don't know. We always think the letters mean so much. And we go to all this trouble and then it amounts to nothing except it entertains us 2,500 years later.
Wait, first of all, I think it's just much easier to remember by heart.
Yeah.
It's really helpful when it's a kostichon. Anything, you just know what's supposed to come next.
Right.
Which we keep
I was
talking about it as
thinking-
read. It's not read poetry, it's heard poetry.
Heard poetry, yeah. Robert?
I was thinking that covering the full range of the alphabet suggests a kind of completeness or universality, like, this is it.
Yeah.
This is everything.
That's what the rabbis say in the Midrash. There's a line, can't remember exactly, but it says, Eichah is written in acrostics because it covers all of Jerusalem's transgressions, from Aleph to Tav, from A to Z so there's a sense of, in our idiom, we would say when something's covered A to Z, it's covered in completeness, right?
But I think that we're out of chronology again. Even my question, after I thought about it, it was out of chronology. You know what I mean? That's what the rabbis were saying after that. We don't know if the people who were writing this thought that. Just,
Right.
The effort, like, it probably is much more practical. If everybody knew the alphabet, I don't know who knew the alphabet in 500 BC. Who did know? Was the custom, our great pride that we were such a literate people, especially boys. Did everybody know the alphabet in 500 BC that it made it easier? I'm asking Gila.
And did
I
this,
think you weren't paying attention, Gila.
No, I was paying attention. I just have no answer. I have no idea who knew it. But if people who were in charge of remembering
That's
poetry
true.
had their systems.
They had to remember and repeat.
I don't know if it was.
Teach the next generation made it easier for them. Okay.
Right.
So,
Oh, sorry.
but unlike the Kaddish, it's not written in Aramaic, which was the language of the people. This is not written in the language of the people, right? The Kaddish was written in Aramaic, so they said. I mean, maybe not. That the reason the Kaddish was in Aramaic was that way everybody understood it. It was Am Haaretz. This is not Am Haaretz. This is something else.
Hebrew was the language of the people prior to the destruction of the first temple, though.
Yeah, Hebrew was the language. This was the language. Aramaic only became the language of the people much later on.
as they moved. Yeah.
Peter would know. I mean, Peter, Bevakasha, you tell us.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't be able to also answer who knew the alphabet. I'm like you, we would not be able to know that. And I would say that there's great evidence that alphabetic things were used for the purpose of memorization. I think that there's something more to this in Eichah, though, because they could have written any way they wanted, but they chose the alphabetic form, the alphabetic acrostic form. I see somebody else has their hand up, though.
Well, my thought is, I have two thoughts at least. One is whether there isn't, I'll call it a kind of poetry. Aleph, 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 Beit, Beit, Beit. That produces, it's not rhythm in the way that we normally think of, but the patterning has a certain quality that maybe even we could call musical. The other thought I have is, because I haven't studied this text, are we saying first, first, first? These are the three most, second, second, and I don't know about that, but I do feel that sense that it may contribute to rhythm for what that's.
I would agree with that too.
I think the rabbi was asking Peter, though, or she already knew the whole, when people started talking Aramaic.
Yeah, no, the Hebrew was the language of the people until afterwards. Yeah, it started because after the Babylonian Empire, what was the next empire? The Persians.
Persian.
And then Aramaic became the lingua franca, so to speak.
Oh, of Persia?
The Persians had Aramaic.
Oh.
And then just, like when the Greeks took over, what was the lingua franca? Greek.
Well, the Persians themselves spoke Farsi, but Aramaic was used.
It became underneath the Persians the
language. It was the countries they'd conquered.
Yeah, it became
or Brant or
what
whatever.
you wanted to do if you wanted to do business and things like that.
It was Paramaic.
All right, I think that's all I'm going to do. I was going to have a little bit about another story, but I'll end there in case there's any more questions or comments or thoughts.
We only interrupt. We don't respond when you ask if there's.
It's been, there were so many great comments and questions. It was really great to do this together. I hope you had fun looking at poetry on a Shabbat.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
Very much. Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you. This was fascinating as usual, and as usual left me and I'm sure other people also with many questions and a new way of looking at Eichah. So thank you very much. This was a very good ending to a month of kind of making our way towards Tisha'h B'Av,
Right.
and towards the questions of death and mourning and ritual around this. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you being with us here.
Maybe I will give you the last line here. This to me is the poet's dilemma in a nutshell here, right? This is from the second chapter. The poet asks, talking to Jerusalem personified, what shall I take to witness for you? What shall I liken to you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What shall I equal to you that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? For your devastation is great like the sea. Who can heal you? So the poet's saying, I want to do something, but I don't know what metaphors to use. My language kind of falls short for the purposes of healing. I think it kind of encapsulates the book of Eichah in a nutshell there.
I wish you hadn't shared it. I get distracted by the, how can I comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? You know?
Oh, yeah.
It's just like, again, like all the other stuff I could, in the other verses, I could handle it as, you know, metaphorical body and abject suffering of the woman or the body. And this is so clear. You know, you've lost your virginity, you're a fallen woman.
Right.
And it just leaps out at me and it's hard to let go. Whereas
Right.
I can glide over it everywhere else.
Yeah, unfortunately, the Bible is full of this type of
Yeah.
patriarchal ideology.
You know, a few slides ago, you had that one where the woman was speaking in first person.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that was very interesting. I felt like we should copy it and make a sign hang on every homeless person
Right.
we come across, you know?
Yeah,
That was, can you go back to it? It was so powerful. It's what I think of when I go see people. Oh, maybe not. Okay. Is it nothing to you all who pass by and look and see?
Right.
If there's any sorrow like my sorrow, which was brought upon me. I guess the first column.
Right.
Certainly in a hot day, no cooling center, he's left me stunned and faint all day long. Sounds pretty literal.
All
Thank
right.
you very much, Peter. Thank you
Yes.
very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me again. I think some people left here when we did that the last time, but it's always a great pleasure to be at TBO.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.